Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the wild, unpredictable world of medieval farming. Imagine yourself in the thick of it, the scent of fresh soil mixing with the faint, earthy tang of wet hay, the creaking of wooden plows as they dig into the ground. It's a life driven by nature's whims, with a constant dance between hope and hardship. There's no weather app to check. Just your gut, the sky, and the gods. You're at the mercy of Mother Nature, and you know it. You probably won't survive this. You'll likely be at the mercy of a random frost or a drought. But hey, at least you get to try. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is at your place right now. Always curious to see how far this history journey is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval farming wasn't exactly the picturesque, peaceful hobby it's sometimes made out to be. Oh no, it was hard, grueling work, filled with uncertainty. Farmers didn't just plant seeds and wait for crops to magically appear. Every season brought its own set of challenges, from battling pests to praying for rain. It was a way of life in constant flux. And the weather was the trickiest player of all. It could be your greatest ally or your worst enemy. One moment, the sun would shine and the fields would thrive. The next, a storm could wipe out everything you worked for. Farmers had one thing that kept them going: resourcefulness. Without modern tools or weather apps, they learned to read the skies in ways that could make your head spin. Of course, these weather tricks weren't always foolproof. In fact, they could be wildly inaccurate. But farmers did their best, using every bit of wisdom from generations past to give themselves a fighting chance. It was like living in a constant state of preparation and prayer. Historians still argue whether these methods were truly effective or simply a blend of hope, superstition, and a little bit of good luck. But one thing's for sure: if you were a medieval farmer, you learned to rely on everything you had. Whether it was observing animal behavior, consulting the stars, or following ancient customs, each little trick had its place in the vast web of survival. The rhythm of the seasons, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, dictated every aspect of a medieval farmer's life. Each turn of the year was a cycle of work, expectation, and, often, anxiety. After all, the weather didn't just influence crops, it shaped the entire framework of society. In a time where the majority of people lived off the land, a good harvest meant survival. While a poor one could spell disaster, you'd wake up every day, knowing that the future of your farm depended entirely on forces beyond your control. It's like living in a never-ending game of roulette with nature holding the wheel. For you, as a medieval farmer, the start of the planting season was an exhilarating time. The sun's first warm rays after the long winter seemed to promise prosperity. You'd prepare the soil, sow the seeds, and wait, just wait, for the rains to come. But these rains weren't guaranteed. You didn't have a weather forecast to tell you whether or not the clouds would show up on time. You just had to trust in the old signs and signals that had been passed down through generations. The swallows arriving early might mean a wet season, while the absence of certain flowers could indicate drought. It was all a delicate dance with nature's whims. It wasn't all about waiting, though. The farmer's life was one of constant labor, no matter the season. If the harvest was good, It would keep you busy with storage, preserving, and preparing for the months ahead. If it was bad, well, you'd likely be spending the winters scrimping and saving, rationing what little you had until the next planting season. But in the middle of it all, you would find little moments of peace, sitting under the shade of a tree during the heat of the day, watching the clouds roll by, and praying that the right kind of weather would continue to sustain you. Historians still argue about just how much of a farmer's life was dictated by luck and how much by skill. Was it the careful planning and land management that made a successful harvest? Or was it just the weather? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, though the weather definitely had the final word. And the farmers, for all their wisdom, often found themselves at the mercy of that invisible hand. The truth is, as much as medieval farmers tried to predict the weather, they didn't always get it right. You could spend hours, days, even observing the sky, the clouds, the behavior of animals, and all the other little signs nature offered. But even then, weather forecasting was a bit of a guessing game. For every sunny, calm season that brought the crops you needed, there was another year when a surprise frost hit too early, or a summer drought wiped out everything. You had to learn to live with uncertainty and hope that your own knowledge could tip the odds in your favor. The weather was a fickle friend. The rain could come in perfect intervals, just when you needed it, and the sun could shine at the right moments, coaxing your crops to grow. But, as many medieval farmers quickly learned, this was hardly the norm. The weather had a way of turning on you, leaving you wondering what you missed, what sign you failed to catch, and why you were left praying for a crop that might never arrive. In some years, the climate would shift, and no amount of intuition or ancient wisdom could change the outcome. You, as a farmer, were constantly watching for signs. When the wind shifted, did it carry rain, or would it turn dry again? When the birds started their migration, what did that tell you? The relationship between the weather and crop success was a delicate balance. Farmers would often tell you, if the swallows fly high, then the harvest will be dry, or if the fog lingers at dawn, expect a good rain. But the trick was knowing when to trust these signs and when to take them with a pinch of salt. Historians still argue whether these ancient weather signs were based on actual observation, or if they were merely cultural constructs meant to soothe the anxious minds of farmers. Maybe the signs worked sometimes, and maybe they didn't. But what we do know is that these methods were passed down with a reverence that suggests they were more than just superstition. For you, as a farmer, they were the tools you had to work with, your only means of trying to predict the unpredictability of nature. And every year, you'd bet your crops on them. But it wasn't just observation that made medieval farmers experts in the unpredictable weather game. They had other tricks up their sleeves. For instance, they knew how to work the land itself to influence the weather. You could call it weather manipulation, or maybe farmer's magic. It wasn't about casting spells, per se, but it was about understanding how to shape the environment to encourage favorable conditions. They'd use animal manure to fertilize the soil, knowing that the richer the soil, the better it could absorb rain and hold on to moisture. They might even create windbreaks, rows of trees planted around fields to protect crops from harsh winds. This was their way of fighting the elements, one small step at a time. And then there were the rituals. Farmers, especially in rural areas, often turned to old pagan practices to improve their fortunes. If a drought threatened, they might leave out offerings, milk, bread, or even a precious goose to appease the gods. If storms were forecast, farmers would gather around in groups, performing dances and chants to beg for fair weather. It wasn't much different from the weather dances performed by indigenous cultures across the world. It was the same fundamental belief that by aligning with the forces of nature, you could influence the outcome. Sometimes, these rituals were more symbolic than effective, a way for the community to come together and share in a collective hope. Other times, they might involve more direct actions. Some farmers believed that the very act of dancing around a bonfire on certain nights would cause rain to fall in time for a good harvest. Historians still argue whether these ancient weather rituals had any effect, or whether they were simply a way for communities to relieve the stress and tension of a life dependent on the whims of nature. Either way, the rituals were as much a part of farming life as the plow itself. They were, after all, a form of insurance, a way of creating an illusion of control over forces that seemed far too powerful to understand. These practices weren't universal, but they were deeply embedded in the agricultural communities. If you were a farmer in medieval Europe, there was no question that superstition and ritual had their place in the world. And while we may scoff at these practices today, imagining them as primitive or misguided, they were a form of resilience. They allowed people to hold on to hope in times when hope was in short supply. In their world, these small acts of faith were as necessary as the work itself. And then there was the moon. Medieval farmers didn't just follow the sun's rhythms, they had a profound connection to the lunar cycle. To them, the phases of the moon weren't just a backdrop to their lives. They were a critical guide to planting, harvesting, and even the health of their crops. The full moon, for example, was often seen as the perfect time to sow seeds. It was believed that the increased light would help the seeds take root, fostering strong and healthy plants. On the flip side, the new moon was a time for quieter work, such as planting root vegetables, which needed to grow beneath the surface and could thrive without the full moon's bright rays. As a farmer, you'd spend months learning the intricacies of these cycles. Some swore that planting on a waxing moon would increase the yield, while others insisted that the waning moon brought better harvests for root vegetables. And it wasn't just the planting that was governed by the moon. Harvesting, too, was tied to lunar phases. For centuries, farmers believed that crops harvested during a waxing moon would store better, while those harvested during a waning moon would spoil faster. The moon was more than a celestial body. It was an integral part of your survival. Historians still argue whether these lunar connections were based on genuine observation or simply cultural beliefs passed down over generations. Did the moon truly affect crop yields? Or was it the rituals and timing of these practices that gave farmers a sense of control over their fate? One thing's for sure. The moon was as much a tool in the medieval farmer's kit as the plow or the sickle. It was both a literal and metaphorical light in the dark, helping to guide you through the uncertainties of farming life. But it wasn't just about superstition and belief. There was some science, at least as much as medieval people could understand. Behind this lunar wisdom, the moon does indeed influence water, from the tides of the ocean to the moisture in the soil. And it stands to reason that the gravitational pull of the moon could have some effect on plant growth, though it's more likely that the timing of planting around the moon's cycle was just one more way for farmers to structure the chaos of their lives. Either way, it worked for them, or at least they believed it did. But of course, nature wasn't always so cooperative. And when the skies turned hostile, It wasn't just science or superstition that medieval farmers relied on. In many rural communities, there was also a heavy dose of spirituality woven into farming practices. The old ways of pagan worship didn't simply disappear with the arrival of Christianity. They became intermingled, reshaped into a kind of farming faith. When rain didn't come as expected, or when crops seemed destined to wither away, farmers would often turn to rituals, prayers, and sacrifices. These weren't necessarily dark, frightening rituals. They were often seen as necessary acts of devotion to ensure the favor of the divine. For example, one common practice was the offering of animals or crops to the gods in hopes of better weather. If a drought threatened the harvest, it wasn't unheard of for villagers to sacrifice a prized cow or goose, believing that this would somehow appease the gods or spirits who controlled the rain. In other areas, there were elaborate prayers recited by the elders, who would stand at the edge of fields and plead for a change in the weather. The more desperate the farmer, the more extravagant the ritual. In some cases, this would involve the entire community, with chants and songs sung around a central fire as a way to invoke divine intervention. Historians still argue whether these pagan rituals were truly effective or whether they were just a manifestation of the community's collective anxieties. Did the gods really listen? Or were these ceremonies simply a psychological release for the people who were otherwise powerless against the forces of nature, whether or not they worked? These rituals provided a sense of control, a small way for farmers to feel like they could influence the uncontrollable. It was also a moment for communities to bond together, offering a form of hope that transcended individual fears. Over time, the Christian Church began to influence these older practices. Saints were invoked to control the weather, especially those associated with agriculture, like Saint Medard, who was thought to have the power to stop rain, or Saint Isidore, the patron saint of farmers. In this way, ancient rituals adapted and evolved. Merging with new religious beliefs, it's fascinating to think that a farmer in the 12th century might have been both praying to Saint Isidore for a bountiful harvest and performing a ritual to the old pagan gods to ensure favorable weather. And in those moments, the boundary between faith and superstition seemed a lot more blurred. But as much as farmers prayed, sacrificed, and used every bit of ancient knowledge to coax the weather into cooperating, sometimes the inevitable happened, a poor harvest. And when that occurred, it wasn't just the farmers who suffered. The entire community would feel the sting of famine. A bad harvest was a disaster, and its effects could ripple through the entire social structure, causing widespread hunger, poverty, and even death. For a medieval farmer, a single failed crop could be the difference between survival and ruin. It wasn't just about missing a meal, it was about the collapse of everything that had been carefully built over the course of a year. Your livelihood, your family's well-being, and even your place in the community. Famine wasn't a rare event. It was part of life. And it wasn't just caused by bad weather. Poor weather conditions were certainly a factor, but so were pest infestations, crop diseases, and even poor soil management. But when the weather turned particularly vicious, say, a long, brutal winter or an unexpected frost in the spring, farmers were often left powerless. There were no contingency plans, no insurance, just a long, desperate wait to see whether the crop would grow or fail. And if it failed, the consequences could be devastating. When the crops didn't come in, communities would struggle to find food. Bread, which was the staple of the medieval diet, would become scarce. Livestock would be slaughtered to provide what little sustenance could be salvaged. People would resort to eating anything they could get their hands on, and even that wouldn't be enough. It wasn't uncommon for entire villages to go into hiding, seeking whatever food they could find in the wild to survive. Hunger brought with it not only physical weakness, but also social unrest, as desperate people would sometimes turn against their neighbors to steal food or take advantage of the weak. Historians still argue about the frequency and severity of medieval famines. Some experts suggest that poor weather alone wasn't enough to cause a famine. Rather, it was a confluence of events, including crop failure, disease, and poor leadership, that led to widespread hunger. But regardless of the cause, the result was the same. Famine wreaked havoc on the population, leading to weakened immune systems, increased mortality rates, and economic instability. And during these times, the farmer's knowledge of the land and weather, though vital, could only do so much. Without the rains or sun, the crops simply wouldn't grow. While a bad harvest and famine were terrifying possibilities, medieval farmers didn't just wait for disaster to strike. Over time, they developed a range of strategies and innovations to better manage their land and protect their crops, one of the most important being crop rotation. This technique was a game changer in the agricultural world, transforming the way medieval farmers approached their fields. It wasn't just about planting the same crops in the same soil year after year. It was about giving the earth time to rest and recover. The system was simple, yet brilliant. Rotate the crops in a way that allowed the soil to replenish its nutrients, reducing the risk of depleting the land. In practice, crop rotation worked like this. Farmers would divide their fields into sections, planting one section with a particular crop in one year, and then switching it the next. For instance, wheat might be planted one year, followed by peas or beans the next. The legumes, like peas, had the special ability to enrich the soil by fixing nitrogen, which was a crucial nutrient for other plants. This practice not only helped maintain soil health, but also minimized the risk of crop failure. If one crop didn't fare well, the others might still thrive, giving the farmer a better chance at a decent harvest. This technique wasn't just some lucky accident. It was based on years of observation and trial and error. Farmers knew that overusing the same patch of land without letting it rest would lead to poor yields and soil exhaustion. It's fascinating to think about how these practices were passed down through generations. These weren't just techniques. They were survival tactics, forged in the harshest of conditions, designed to keep the land fertile and productive for as long as possible. Historians still argue about when crop rotation was first implemented in Europe. Some believe it was a practice borrowed from the ancient Romans, who were known for their agricultural expertise. Others claim it was a development of the medieval period, shaped by local knowledge and necessity. Either way, it marked a huge step forward in the quest to manage the land and its challenges. While it didn't guarantee perfect harvests, it certainly made farmers' lives a little easier. And it helped ensure that they had something to bring to market each year, even in the face of unpredictable weather. Now, let's talk about one of the unsung heroes of medieval farming: the animals. They weren't just for food or companionship. They played an absolutely vital role in making the farm function, especially when it came to dealing with the weather. Plowing, for example, was one of the most demanding tasks on the farm. Without the right tools or machines, it was up to animals like oxen and horses to do the heavy lifting. These hard-working creatures were key in helping farmers manage the land efficiently, particularly when the weather made the soil difficult to work with. Oxen, with their massive size and strength, were preferred for plowing, Their slow but steady pace allowed them to break up tough soil without exhausting themselves. Horses, on the other hand, were faster and could be used for lighter tasks, like pulling carts or hauling harvests. But beyond their practical uses, these animals also played a unique role in weather prediction. Farmers noticed patterns in their behavior, using these signs as clues to anticipate changes in the weather. If the oxen suddenly started acting restless or refused to work, it might be a sign of an incoming storm. Horses, being a bit more temperamental, were also used to gauge when the weather might shift. But it wasn't just the work animals that helped with weather forecasting. Farmers would look at the behavior of the birds, the insects, and even their own livestock for signals of what might come. A rooster crowing early in the morning was believed to signal clear skies, while a sudden quiet from the usual morning chorus of birds might suggest rain. Similarly, cows would often refuse to graze in certain conditions, with their reluctance being interpreted as a sign of a coming downpour. Historians still argue about the extent to which these animal-based predictions were reliable. But they were certainly embedded in the farming practices of the time. Whether it was through careful observation or simple superstition, farmers were always looking for ways to read nature's subtle cues. And while there's no concrete proof that the behavior of animals could predict the weather with any great accuracy, it's clear that medieval farmers relied on their instincts and experiences, just as much as they relied on their animals, to navigate the challenges of the land. The connection between medieval farmers and the spiritual realm was strong, especially when it came to matters like the weather. In times of hardship, when the clouds refused to part or the rain didn't come, farmers often turned to the saints. The Catholic Church had a profound influence on everyday life during the medieval period, and that included agriculture. Saints were seen as powerful intercessors between humanity and the divine, and many were specifically linked to agriculture and weather. You, as a medieval farmer, might find yourself invoking Saint Isidore, the patron saint of farmers, or Saint Medard, who was believed to control the rain. These saints were your go-to weather gods, and farmers would pray for their intervention in times of need. The prayers were simple, often recited at dawn or dusk, as you stood in your fields, hoping for a divine blessing on your crops. Saint Isidore, protect our crops and send rain to nourish them, was a typical plea. But it wasn't all about praying quietly. In some villages, there were public processions where entire communities would gather to beg for favorable weather. They'd march around the fields, singing hymns and waving banners in honor of the saints, hoping that their collective devotion would move the heavens. It was less about having a personal conversation with God and more about showing solidarity with your fellow villagers, creating a spiritual bond that linked you all to the cycles of nature. Historians still argue whether these religious practices were truly effective in terms of weather manipulation, or if they were simply psychological crutches during tough times. Regardless, the faith of medieval farmers in their saints was undeniable. These practices gave them a sense of control over an otherwise uncontrollable environment. They couldn't change the weather, but they believed that through prayer and devotion, they could encourage divine favor. Interestingly, the link between farming and saints wasn't just about weather. Saints were also believed to protect against pests and blights. Saint George, the famous dragon slayer, was called upon to defend crops from insects, while Saint Barbara was invoked to keep the harvest safe from thunderstorms. This interplay between religion and farming, while often seen as a blend of superstition and faith, was deeply ingrained in medieval life. It gave farmers not just hope, but a feeling of companionship in their struggle against nature's capriciousness. While saints played a significant role in the spiritual side of farming, the church also had a more practical impact on the way weather and agricultural cycles were understood. You, as a medieval farmer, didn't only rely on your personal belief system or the supernatural. The church was also deeply involved in interpreting and sometimes even controlling the agricultural calendar, which had its own links to weather. The liturgical calendar, full of feast days, saints' celebrations, and religious observances, was often synchronized with the seasons and agricultural needs. And, while you might have been praying to Saint Isidore for good weather, the church itself played a role in dictating when you should plant, harvest, and prepare for winter. The church held the power to set feast days that marked crucial points in the agricultural year. These feasts were scheduled around key agricultural moments: planting in the spring, harvesting in the late summer, and preparing for the cold months of winter. When these feast days arrived, they often coincided with times when you'd need to be most aware of the weather. The day of St. Bartholomew in August, for instance, was a critical marker for many farmers, signaling the right time to harvest certain crops, especially grains. In this way, the church was guiding you to make decisions based on their understanding of the seasons, which, more often than not, aligned with traditional weather patterns. However, the church's influence didn't stop at scheduling. For many medieval farmers, it was the clergy who interpreted the weather as either a blessing or a punishment from God. Bad weather, floods, droughts, and crop failures was often seen as divine retribution for sins. You might have been told that the storm that ruined your wheat crop was a sign of God's anger, or a warning that you weren't following the proper moral or spiritual guidelines. This connection between weather and divine punishment was reinforced by the church, especially in times of crisis, where a poor harvest was a tangible sign of a deeper spiritual problem. Historians still debate how much of this weather-based theology was used to maintain social control. Was it truly the belief of the people that the weather reflected divine favor or wrath? Or was it a tool used by the church to enforce its influence over everyday life? Either way, the belief that the weather was a direct reflection of one's relationship with the divine was deeply ingrained in the medieval worldview. As a farmer, you were never just dealing with the practicalities of planting and harvesting. You were also contending with the cosmic balance between sin and salvation, fate and favor. There's another fascinating aspect to the medieval farming world, one that brought a bit of a twist to the weather forecasting game: the Vikings. Yes, the Vikings. Those fierce sea raiders and warriors weren't just known for their conquests. They also had a lasting influence on farming techniques, especially in Northern Europe. When they raided and later settled in areas like the British Isles, Ireland, and even parts of France, they brought their own agricultural knowledge with them, which included a few tricks for predicting and dealing with the weather. The Vikings were hardy, resourceful, and, as you might imagine, highly attuned to the natural world around them. They had to be. If you were living in the harsh climates of Scandinavia, where the weather could be unpredictable and brutal, you'd learn to read the signs of nature with a precision that rivaled any modern weather forecaster. They studied wind patterns, cloud formations, and the behavior of animals in ways that allowed them to better understand when to plant and when to harvest. They even had weather gods, like Thor, who were believed to have control over storms and rain. Viking farmers, much like their medieval counterparts, depended heavily on the weather to succeed. However, the Vikings had some unique methods of dealing with unfavorable conditions. For example, they were known for creating sturdy barns with thatched roofs, which could help keep out the cold, snow, and rain. This wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. In a harsh winter, a barn full of crops could be the difference between life and death. The Vikings also practiced a form of weatherproofing their farming by diversifying what they grew. Rather than putting all their resources into one crop, they spread their bets across a variety of hardy plants and animals. This way, if one crop failed due to a storm or frost, others might survive. Historians still argue about the extent to which Viking farming practices influenced the agricultural methods of the regions they settled. Did their unique understanding of the weather change the way medieval farmers approached their own land? While it's difficult to say for sure, one thing is clear. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were also keen observers of the weather and its impact on farming. Their knowledge became part of the broader agricultural knowledge shared across Northern Europe, blending with the local practices and influencing future generations. As we move deeper into medieval farming practices, it's hard to overlook the connection between astronomy and agriculture. For the average medieval farmer, the stars weren't just something to gaze at on clear nights. They were guides. The constellations, the movements of planets, and the phases of the moon all played a role in their understanding of the weather and the seasons. If you were out in the fields after dark, working late to finish your harvest, you'd often glance up at the sky for clues on what might come next. One of the most important tools in your celestial weather forecasting kit is the Bosimdash was the position of the stars. Farmers would use certain constellations to mark when specific tasks needed to be done. For example, the appearance of the constellation Aries marked the beginning of spring and was often used as a signal to start planting. Similarly, the sight of the Pleiades cluster, a group of stars that became visible in late winter, was seen as a sign that the weather would soon turn milder, making it safe to begin sowing seeds. The stars didn't just tell you when to work, they gave you hope, too. In a way, they were a cosmic rhythm that reminded you that life would go on, even after the harshness of winter. But astronomy wasn't just about timing. It was also about predicting changes in the weather. Farmers would observe the planets, especially Venus and Jupiter, to see if they were out of place in the night sky. The movement of these planets was sometimes interpreted as a harbinger of weather patterns to come. For instance, if Venus appeared to rise in the west, it might mean that rain was on the way. The idea was that the skies above were more than just random events. They were linked to the earth below, and understanding one could give you a leg up on the other. Historians still argue about how advanced medieval astronomy really was. While they didn't have telescopes or the kind of knowledge we have today, it's clear that medieval farmers were keen observers of the natural world, and the sky was a central part of that observation. Did they understand the stars the way we do? Probably not. But they understood enough to use the heavens as a map, helping them make better decisions about when to plant and harvest, and when to prepare for the weather that was coming. Despite all their efforts, whether they were watching animal behavior, performing rituals, or consulting the stars, medieval farmers still had to contend with the unpredictability of the weather. It's often said that the Middle Ages had no reliable weather forecast. But in truth, medieval farmers weren't completely in the dark about what was coming. They had their own methods of predicting the weather. And while they may not have been as accurate as today's sophisticated forecasts, they had a certain ingenuity in reading the natural world. One of the most widely known forms of weather prediction came from folklore. Sayings like, "A red sky at night, shepherd's delight," were common knowledge. If the sky was particularly red at sunset, it was often taken as a sign of fair weather the following day. This was based on the fact that a red sky often occurs when high-pressure systems, indicating clear weather, are in place. Similarly, when the dew is on the grass, rain will come to pass was another way farmers would predict rainfall, based on the observation that dew forms when humidity levels are high, often a precursor to rain. Then there were the more nuanced methods. For example, farmers would sometimes check the behavior of plants themselves. Certain flowers and plants, like the common daisy or the tulip, were known to close at night and open with the sun. If they opened early, it was seen as a sign of good weather to come. Similarly, the way the leaves of trees swayed in the wind or the kind of clouds that appeared in the sky were indicators for the astute farmer to figure out what kind of weather might be headed their way. Historians still argue whether these methods were based on real, systematic observations or whether they were simply a collection of folk wisdom passed down over generations. It's likely that many of these weather predictions were more luck than science, but some of them were based on patterns that held true for the farmers of the time. And let's be honest, when you're trying to make a living off the land, even a little bit of luck is often just what you need to get through a tough year. In the end, these methods, along with the hard work and determination of the farmers, allowed medieval agriculture to survive and even thrive, despite the vagaries of the weather. The trials and tribulations they faced are hard to imagine for us today, with our weather apps and satellites. But for them, every shift in the weather, every changing cloud, was a reminder of just how dependent they were on the land and the skies. As we come to the end of this journey through the world of medieval farming, it's fascinating to reflect on the legacy of those weather tricks and survival strategies. What may have seemed like a chaotic, uncertain life, constantly at the mercy of unpredictable weather, was, in fact, a life built on resourcefulness, observation, and the desire for control over an otherwise uncontrollable world. Even without the modern conveniences we take for granted, medieval farmers found ways to thrive and ensure that their crops and their families survived. The medieval farmer didn't just rely on superstition, despite what many might think. Sure, they invoked saints, performed rituals, and consulted the stars. But they were also keen observers of the natural world. They learned to read the signs of the weather in ways that modern science might find surprisingly accurate. In fact, many of the techniques and methods that were pioneered in the medieval period, like crop rotation and the careful observation of animal behavior, still inform farming practices today. In some ways, their understanding of the weather was based on a deep connection to the land, an intuitive knowledge of the environment that was passed down through generations. As you drift into the peaceful rhythm of sleep tonight, consider how these long-forgotten practices still echo in the work of farmers today. Modern agriculture is far removed from medieval methods, but the basic principles, working with nature, not against it, are the same. The farmers of the past were not so different from those today who still rely on weather patterns and natural cycles to guide their work. The only difference now is that we have more precise tools to predict the weather, and yet the fundamentals remain unchanged. So as you close your eyes and imagine the soft rustling of a medieval farm in the cool night air, remember the resilience of those who worked the land with nothing but the stars, the sky, and their own hands. They may not have had the technology we do, but they had something just as valuable: an intimate knowledge of the land they tended, a fierce determination, and a deep connection to the natural rhythms of the world. Now, take a deep breath. Feel the calm wash over you, and let the quiet rhythm of the seasons cradle you to sleep. The earth may have been unpredictable, but in the end, it was always there, waiting to nurture and sustain those who understood how to live in harmony with it. Now, let's turn our attention to two unseen forces that had a profound impact on medieval farming: wind and water. These elements, though invisible to the eye, were as much a part of the farmer's toolkit as the plow or the sickle. The wind, particularly in northern regions, could be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it could help dry the crops after a heavy rain, ensuring that they didn't rot in the fields. On the other, a strong, cold wind could ruin everything you had worked for. A hard frost, carried by the wind, could wipe out an entire crop overnight. Farmers had to be keenly aware of wind patterns, especially when it came to protecting their fields. To mitigate these challenges, medieval farmers created windbreaks, rows of trees or bushes planted along the edges of fields to protect crops from harsh winds. These simple barriers not only shielded crops, but also helped reduce soil erosion, which could be exacerbated by constant exposure to strong winds. It was a practice that kept the soil intact and ensured that the crops didn't get carried away with the breeze. The farmers knew that the wind wasn't something they could control, but they could use it to their advantage by strategically managing the landscape. Water, however, was another beast entirely. Medieval farmers were deeply attuned to the water cycle, which was as unpredictable as it was essential. Water was life for crops, but too much or too little of it could mean disaster. A torrential downpour could flood fields, washing away seeds and crops. Conversely, a drought could turn the land to dust, leaving crops shriveled and useless. Medieval farmers used a variety of strategies to control water flow, such as digging ditches to redirect rainwater or building water mills to harness the power of streams for irrigation. The ability to manage water was crucial for survival. Those who mastered it often fared better during years of unpredictable rainfall. Historians still argue whether early medieval farmers understood the hydrological cycle in the way we do today. While they didn't have modern tools or technologies, their careful observation of natural patterns allowed them to create systems that worked for them. The control of wind and water was less about science and more about living in harmony with nature's rhythms, using what they had at their disposal to survive. Now that we've explored the powerful forces of wind and water, let's take a look at the unsung heroes of medieval farming. The family. In the medieval period, farming wasn't a solitary endeavor. It was a family affair, where every member of the household played an essential role in the success or failure of the harvest. You, as a farmer, couldn't afford to work alone. Everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, had something to contribute to the farm's operation, especially when the weather was unpredictable. As a child, your tasks might not have seemed like much. You'd help fetch water, gather firewood, or assist with planting seeds. But even at a young age, you learned to read the signs of the weather. Was the air thick with humidity? Were the clouds shifting in the distance as you grew older? You would have been entrusted with more responsibilities, such as tending to animals, harvesting crops, and helping to repair tools and buildings. You were, in a sense, the next generation of weather watchers and farmers. Your eyes and ears were constantly tuned to the shifting sky, and the patterns you observed over the years shaped your understanding of the land. The elderly members of the family also had their place in the farming world. While they might not have had the physical strength to do the heavy lifting, they possessed something just as valuable: wisdom. They'd often be the ones telling the stories of past harvests, teaching the younger generation how to read the sky, how to predict the coming frost, or when to plant and harvest based on their experiences. The knowledge passed down through generations was invaluable. Sometimes, it was the only thing standing between a successful harvest and failure. The family dynamic on a medieval farm was built on cooperation and shared knowledge. It wasn't just about planting seeds or harvesting crops. It was about reading the weather, understanding the land, and working together to ensure survival. Historians still debate how much of this cooperative work was rooted in necessity versus tradition. Some believe it was simply a matter of survival, without the family's collective effort. The farm couldn't thrive. Others argue that this way of life was deeply ingrained in the culture, a form of unity that was just as important as the physical labor. As a farmer, you were never truly alone. The land, the weather, and your family were all part of the same intricate dance. And when the storm clouds gathered, you knew you weren't just facing them alone. Your family, your ancestors, and the collective wisdom of generations were with you, guiding your every move. Let's now take a step back and consider the larger community context in which medieval farmers lived. While you might have spent most of your days working on your own plot of land, the health of your farm and your family was intrinsically tied to the broader network of towns, markets, and neighbors. It wasn't enough to just tend to your crops in isolation. You relied on a complex web of social and economic relationships to make sure that your harvests were successful, even in the face of uncertain weather. Towns played an essential role in this system, especially when it came to weathering the storms of a bad harvest. When your crops didn't turn out as expected, your neighbors and local market traders would be there to help you through. The towns were the place where goods were traded, and the market was where food was exchanged. If your fields had been devastated by a spring frost or a sudden summer storm, you could often find the supplies you needed at the market. People in the towns were, in many ways, your safety net. You didn't just rely on townspeople when things went wrong, they were also your connection to new ideas and innovations. The market wasn't just a place for bartering grain and livestock. It was a place for sharing knowledge, too. If someone in the town had a better way of managing water flow, or had learned to predict the weather through a different set of signs, they'd share it. A successful harvest could mean more than just your own survival. It could mean the survival of your whole village. Historians still argue about the extent to which these communal practices were driven by necessity versus social bonds. Was the need to share resources simply about survival? Or was it part of a larger communal ethos that defined medieval life? Either way, these relationships were vital. If you were a farmer, you weren't just a solitary figure working the land. You were part of an interdependent system where each person's success was linked to the next. Whether it was sharing resources, pooling labor, or learning new weather-related techniques, the town, the market, and your neighbors were all integral to surviving the unpredictable whims of nature. In many ways, this community approach mirrored the rhythms of nature itself, interconnected, interdependent, and constantly shifting with the seasons. As we move further into the role of medieval communities, let's explore another critical aspect of survival in the face of bad weather: bartering and trade. When the weather didn't cooperate and crops failed or yielded poorly, farmers couldn't simply wait it out. In times of famine or crop failure, the ability to exchange goods with neighboring farmers or towns was vital. Bartering became not only a lifeline, but a way for farmers to weather the storm, literally and figuratively. Imagine this. It's the end of a long, harsh winter, and your grain crops didn't quite make it due to an early frost. You're low on food, and with the next planting season still a few weeks away. You're relying on your trade relationships to get by. Thankfully, the market is bustling, as people from surrounding areas gather to trade what they can. The local miller might have excess flour, while the butcher has meat to spare. In exchange, you offer some of your remaining livestock, or perhaps some wool you've gathered throughout the winter months. Bartering like this was a vital part of medieval agricultural life. With no currency or modern systems of credit, the exchange of goods was often the only way to survive a bad season. And while the goods themselves were important, the relationships between traders and farmers were even more critical. In a close-knit agricultural community, people knew each other's crops and land, and often trusted one another during times of scarcity. Farmers who couldn't make ends meet might turn to their neighbors first, borrowing what they needed and promising to pay it back once the next harvest came through. These informal agreements were based on the shared understanding that survival depended on community cooperation. Historians still debate how widespread and formalized these trade networks were in medieval farming communities. While some argue that bartering was more ad hoc, people simply sharing resources as needed, others suggest that there were more structured systems in place, especially as towns grew and trade routes expanded. Regardless, the key takeaway is that farmers didn't just work alone. They were part of a larger economic system, one that was deeply interconnected with the rhythms of the weather. Bad weather could ruin a harvest, but it didn't have to spell disaster. With the right network of relationships and a willingness to share and trade, survival was always within reach. In the medieval world, weather wasn't just something to be managed for the sake of survival. It was something to be celebrated. Every season brought its own festival, its own reasons to come together as a community and honor the land and the skies. The rhythms of farming weren't just about toil and labor. They were punctuated by moments of joy and reverence for nature's gifts. The changing weather patterns were marked with seasonal feasts, religious celebrations, and even village-wide rituals, where everyone would come together to celebrate the harvest, pray for rain, or thank the gods for a fruitful year. One of the most important seasonal celebrations in farming communities was the Harvest Festival. This was a time to give thanks for the crop that had been successfully brought in, assuming the weather had cooperated. After months of hard work, the harvest was a moment of joy. With communities celebrating the abundance of grain, fruits, and vegetables, people would gather in the town square, feast on the fruits of their labor, and share in the camaraderie of a bountiful harvest. The event wasn't just about eating and drinking. It was also a time for rituals. Some farmers believed that by performing certain dances or rituals, they could ensure a better harvest in the coming year. For instance, some might dance around a large bonfire to invoke the gods' blessings for the next planting season. On the flip side, there were festivals dedicated to warding off bad weather. When spring rains threatened to be too light or too heavy, communities would hold feasts to pray for balance, rain without floods, warmth without drought. These festivals often had a deeply spiritual element. The people would pray to saints associated with agriculture, like Saint Isidore or Saint Medard, to ensure favorable weather for the coming crops. A drought could be catastrophic, so these festivals were both a celebration of the earth's gifts and a plea for divine intervention. Historians still debate the extent to which these weather celebrations had a true impact on farming outcomes. Was it just a form of catharsis, an emotional release for the community? Or was there some real belief that the gods or spirits could be swayed by the collective energy of a village? What we do know is that these festivals were a vital part of medieval life. They served as a reminder that the success of the harvest wasn't solely in the hands of the farmer. The weather, the seasons, and the divine were all players in the game. By celebrating the harvest and praying for the future, communities affirmed their connection to nature's rhythms, no matter how unpredictable or uncontrollable they might be. While festivals and rituals marked the agricultural calendar, medieval farmers were also deeply reliant on the tools that helped them cope with the changing seasons and weather. The farm tools themselves were products of careful design, honed over generations to help you, the farmer, endure the trials of both good and bad weather. These tools weren't just an extension of your labor. They were essential for survival, allowing you to work the land and respond to whatever the weather might throw your way. One of the most important pieces of equipment was the plow. The medieval plow was designed to break the soil in a way that allowed seeds to be buried deep enough to survive the elements. But it was also built to handle tough weather conditions. In wetter climates, the plow needed to be sturdy enough to turn over damp, heavy soil, while in drier areas, it had to be light enough to avoid breaking through the hard, cracked earth. You'd rely on the oxen to pull it, but even they had to be trained to deal with the forces of nature. Sometimes, a heavy storm or an unexpected cold snap would cause the soil to freeze or harden, making plowing even more difficult. This was when your plow had to be up to the task. The sickle, another crucial tool, was used to harvest your crops once the season's weather had finally allowed them to grow. It might seem simple, but the sickle was a finely honed instrument designed to work with the rhythm of the growing season. Its curved blade was perfect for cutting through the grain without destroying the plants that were still ripening. But when the weather had been particularly challenging, say, during a cold, wet summer when the grain was slow to ripen, harvesting would become an arduous task. If the crops were wet, the sickle would get bogged down in the excess moisture, and you'd have to work quickly to ensure that everything was gathered before the rains returned. Farmers also depended on tools like hoes, rakes, and spades to manage their land, especially when it came to weeding or creating irrigation systems to deal with excessive rainfall. Water mills, too, were vital in places where irrigation was needed. These mills, often powered by rivers or streams, helped control the flow of water, making it possible to distribute it evenly across fields. While these mills didn't directly control the weather, they were a response to its impact, using the flow of water to mitigate periods of drought or flood. Historians still debate how advanced medieval farming tools were compared to modern implements. But one thing is clear. These tools were designed to endure whatever the weather might throw at them. They were built with an understanding of the land, the seasons, and the weather's unpredictable nature. And, much like the farmers themselves, these tools had to be adaptable. They were more than just metal and wood. They were the farmer's partners in a delicate dance with nature's forces. As we've seen, tools, rituals, and communal efforts were crucial in medieval farming. But there was also another important factor at play: the ownership of land. Land wasn't just the foundation of the farmer's livelihood. It was also a symbol of social status, power, and security. The way land was owned and distributed in the medieval world had a profound impact on how farmers interacted with the weather and the land itself. If you were a small peasant farmer, the land you worked was likely owned by a lord or a wealthy landowner. This was common in feudal societies, where the majority of the population worked the land but didn't have ownership over it. In such a system, the quality of your land and the weather it received could determine your success or failure. A bad harvest due to unpredictable weather might mean that you had nothing to pay the lord who owned the land. Worse, it could mean that you lost your land altogether. But if you had access to fertile soil and good weather, your family could survive and even thrive, despite the surrounding hardships. Land ownership was also tied to your ability to deal with the challenges posed by the weather. Those with larger estates could afford more tools, better irrigation systems, and a larger workforce to handle unpredictable weather. The wealthy could also invest in better infrastructure, such as windmills, watermills, and barns to store crops during unfavorable weather conditions. On the other hand, smallholder farmers had to rely more on personal ingenuity and the shared wisdom of their communities. If the weather turned for the worse, they couldn't necessarily afford to replace tools or hire extra help. The farmer's relationship with the land was not just economic. It was a delicate balancing act between nature, social structure, and weather patterns. The feudal system also created power imbalances in terms of access to resources, including the ability to manage weather-related challenges. Lords who owned vast swaths of land had greater power to influence agricultural practices, weather management, and trade. They could create large, efficient farms that benefited from technological innovations and weather predictions passed down by generations of land management. For peasants, however, survival often depended on the charity of their lord or the success of the community's collective efforts. Historians continue to discuss the role land ownership played in medieval society, especially in terms of how it shaped social relationships and economic stability. It's clear, however, that owning land and being able to effectively manage it through weather challenges was a privilege that few had, and one that had significant implications for the individual farmer and the broader social structure. Whether you were a small farmer relying on shared resources or a wealthy landowner with access to advanced farming techniques, your fate was tied to the land, the weather, and how well you could adapt to nature's whims. As we conclude our deep dive into medieval farming and weather, it's important to consider the larger shifts that occurred in the climate and how they impacted farming. One of the most significant environmental changes during the medieval period was the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures that lasted from roughly the 14th to the 19th century. This climatic shift had a profound impact on agriculture, forcing farmers to adjust their practices, adapt to shorter growing seasons, and contend with harsher winters. The cooling trend meant that summers became shorter and colder, while winters were longer and more severe. Crops that had once thrived in slightly warmer conditions, such as grapes and certain grains, became harder to grow. Farmers in Northern Europe, for example, began to see shorter growing seasons, which meant they had less time to get crops in the ground and more pressure to harvest before the first frosts arrived. This had a cascading effect on the entire agricultural system, as food production became less predictable and yields began to decline in some regions. This sudden shift in weather patterns posed a serious challenge to medieval farmers. The land that had once produced bountiful harvests now required more careful attention, more innovative techniques, and greater reliance on communal support to ensure survival. Farmers had to adapt to the changing climate by shifting what they grew, experimenting with new crop varieties that could survive the shorter growing seasons, and altering their farming techniques to cope with the colder temperatures. Some turned to livestock farming as an alternative source of food when crops failed, while others relied on fishing or foraging to supplement their diets. In addition to these immediate changes, the Little Ice Age also had broader socio-political consequences. A decrease in agricultural output led to higher food prices and social unrest. Famine and malnutrition became more common, especially in regions that were hardest hit by the cooling temperatures. The weather, which had always been an unpredictable partner in farming, became even more unreliable, and for many, survival became a daily struggle. Historians still debate the full impact of the Little Ice Age, especially in terms of its long-term effects on medieval societies. Was the cooling trend solely responsible for the famines and social unrest of the period? Or were other factors, such as wars, political instability, and disease, equally important? One thing is clear. Though the changing climate and the unpredictable weather it brought were key players in shaping the course of medieval history. Farmers, who had long relied on their close observation of the weather, found themselves up against forces that they couldn't control, forces that reshaped their world and the way they farmed forever. As we drift into the quiet world of sleep tonight, think about how the weather and climate shaped not just the medieval farmer's life, but the course of history itself. The challenge of navigating unpredictable weather, surviving poor harvests, and adapting to changing conditions is a thread that runs through human history. From the medieval period to our modern world, and even though the tools and technology we have today might be different, that same instinct to observe, adapt, and survive remains.